They were ordered to kill each other. Instead, they sang carols. They were told they were monsters, barbarians, the enemy. Instead, they shook hands, shared cigarettes, and showed each other pictures of their families. For one brief, miraculous moment, in the midst of the most brutal war the world had ever known, the guns fell silent. This is the story of the Christmas Truce of 1914. A story of how, on the frozen, blood-soaked fields of Flanders, enemies became friends and played football in no man's land. To understand how truly miraculous this event was, we have to go back to the beginning of the war, just 5 months earlier. In August 1914, the great powers of Europe plunged into a conflict that most believed would be a glorious, swift adventure. A popular saying in Britain was that it would all be over by Christmas. Young men rushed to enlist, swept up in a wave of patriotic fervor, terrified of missing out on the action. In Germany, the same spirit of 1914 prevailed. A sense of national unity and excitement for a war that was seen as a righteous and necessary defense of the fatherland. The German army marched through Belgium, expecting a quick victory over France. The French and British armies mobilized to meet them. Everyone was convinced of the righteousness of their cause and the certainty of a quick victory. But the War of 1914 was not the war of the 19th century. The machine gun, the rapid-firing artillery piece, and the defensive power of the trench had changed the face of battle forever. The German advance was halted at the Battle of the Marne in September. The subsequent race to the sea, as both sides tried to outflank each other, resulted not in a decisive victory, but in a continuous line of trenches stretching 475 miles. From the Swiss Alps to the North Sea, the war of movement was over. The war of attrition had begun. By December, the initial enthusiasm had curdled into a grim, exhausting reality. Millions of men were living in a hellish, subterranean world. The trenches were a labyrinth of mud, water, and filth. The constant shelling, the ever-present danger of snipers, the disease, the cold, the rats, the lice. It was a life of unimaginable misery. The landscape of no man's land, the narrow strip of ground between the opposing trenches, was a desolate, lunar wasteland. Shell craters, shattered trees, and the tangled skeletal shapes of barbed wire. It was also a graveyard, littered with the unburied bodies of fallen soldiers, their forms slowly sinking into the mud. Disillusionment had set in. The soldiers, who had been promised a short, glorious war, now found themselves trapped in a seemingly endless cycle of death and drudgery. They were cogs in a vast, impersonal machine of slaughter. Yet, in this environment of industrialized killing, a strange and very human phenomenon began to emerge in certain sectors of the front. It was known as the live and let live system. In these quieter sectors, an unspoken understanding developed between the opposing troops. It was a form of ritualized, non-aggressive behavior. They would avoid shelling each other's latrines or ration parties. They would establish a routine, firing at the same time each day, into the same harmless spots, simply to satisfy the generals that they were still fighting. It was a pragmatic arrangement, born of a shared desire to survive. It was a tacit acknowledgement that the man in the trench opposite was not a monster, but another human being in the same miserable situation. This was the fertile ground in which the seeds of the Christmas truce would grow. As Christmas approached, the weather turned bitterly cold. The mud froze solid. A hard frost covered the landscape, which in a strange way made life slightly more bearable than the constant mud. And then, something began to change in the air. Pope Benedict XV had called for a Christmas truce, an appeal that was officially ignored by the warring governments. But the idea of peace at Christmas resonated with the soldiers on the front lines. It started on Christmas Eve. Along many parts of the front, the familiar, terrifying sounds of war began to fade, replaced by something entirely different. The sound of singing. From the German trenches, the strains of Still Nacht, Silent Night drifted across the frozen, shell-scarred landscape. They placed small Christmas trees, Tannenbäume, on the parapets of their trenches, decorated with candles. These tiny points of light, flickering in the darkness, were a defiant symbol of peace and hope in the heart of the war zone. The British soldiers listened in stunned silence. Then, they responded. They began to sing their own carols. The first Noel, O Come, All Ye Faithful, a call and response of Christmas hymns. A bizarre and beautiful concert performed by men who, just hours before, had been locked in a deadly struggle. Shouted conversations began. A German soldier, perhaps with some pre-war experience working in England, would call out in broken English. A British soldier would reply. The initial exchanges were often cautious, laced with the usual battlefield banter. But the tone began to shift. It became friendlier, more curious. Signs were held up. You no shoot. We no shoot. Marmaduke Walkington, a British private, remembered it clearly. We'd been singing carols and this, that, and the other. And the Germans had been doing the same. And we'd been shouting to each other. Sometimes rude remarks, more often just joking remarks. Anyway, eventually, a German said, tomorrow you no shoot, we no shoot. And the morning came, and we didn't shoot, and they didn't shoot. On Christmas morning, the sun rose on a scene that was utterly unprecedented in the history of warfare. All along many sectors of the front, the guns were silent, hesitantly at first. Soldiers began to poke their heads over the parapets. A few brave souls climbed out of the relative safety of their trenches and stood, fully exposed. In no man's land, they were unarmed, their hands held up to show they meant no harm. When they weren't immediately shot, others followed. And then, the enemy did the same, from both sides. Men streamed into the middle of the battlefield. They met, cautiously at first, and then with a growing sense of wonder and relief. They shook hands, they smiled, they spoke to each other. For a few precious hours, the war simply stopped. The men who had been conditioned to see each other as monstrous caricatures, as the enemy, now saw each other for what they were. Young men, just like themselves, caught in the same horrific trap. George Jameson, a British soldier, described the scene with astonishment. Two of his men came running back to the billet, shouting, "What do you know? The Jerrys are out on the top. They're walking about. They're dishing out drinks and cigarettes. There's no fighting going on." Jameson couldn't believe it. He sent his men to see for themselves. They returned with souvenirs. A German helmet, a water bottle. They had shared drinks and smokes with the enemy. "You just wouldn't believe it," they said. The exchange of gifts was widespread. Germans, who were generally better supplied at this stage of the war, offered sausages, schnapps, and cigars. The British offered tins of bully beef, plum pudding, and cigarettes. They traded buttons from their uniforms, pocket knives, and other small trinkets. They showed each other photographs of their families, their wives, their children. In these moments, The abstract, political reasons for the war dissolved, replaced by a powerful, personal connection. But this is where the story we've been told, the beautiful, sanitized version, begins to unravel. Because the Christmas truce was not a universal moment of peace. It was not embraced by everyone, and for some, it was not a moment of hope, but a moment of bitter betrayal. The truce occurred primarily in the British and German sectors of the line, but further south, along the French and Belgian lines, the reaction was very, very different. For the French and Belgian soldiers, this was not an abstract political war being fought in a foreign land. This was their home. The Germans were not just the enemy. They were invaders, standing on French and Belgian soil. They had marched through Belgium, burning villages, executing civilians. They had occupied vast swathes of northern France, turning towns and cities into military zones. For a French or Belgian soldier, the idea of shaking hands with a German, of sharing a cigarette and a laugh, was not an act of humanity. It was an act of treason. Many French units watched the fraternization between the British and the Germans with a mixture of disgust, anger, and incomprehension. They felt betrayed. How could the British, their allies, who had come to help liberate France, be so willing to forget what the Germans had done? How could they so easily set aside the suffering of the French and Belgian people? The French soldiers saw their homes occupied, their families displaced, their land scarred by war. And now, their British comrades were playing football with the men responsible. There were isolated incidents of French soldiers attempting to join in the truce, but they were far less common, and often met with hostility from their own officers and fellow soldiers. The French High Command was particularly furious about any fraternization. They saw it as a dangerous weakening of resolve. The war, for France, was existential. It was about survival, about reclaiming their land. There was no room for sentimentality, no space for seeing the enemy as human. The enemy had to be driven out by any means necessary. This divide, this fundamental difference in perspective, is rarely mentioned in the popular telling of the Christmas truce. We focus on the heartwarming image of British and German soldiers singing together, but we ignore the French soldier, standing in his trench just a few miles away, watching with cold fury, knowing that his village was still under German occupation, that his family was still suffering. The Christmas truce, for him, was not a miracle. It was a painful reminder that not everyone understood what was truly at stake. One of the most important and somber activities during the truce was the burial of the dead. For weeks, the bodies of fallen comrades had lain in the frozen mud of no man's land, impossible to retrieve under the constant fire. Now, in a joint, solemn ceremony, British and German soldiers worked together to give their friends a proper burial. They dug graves in the hard earth. They held shared services, reciting the 23rd Psalm together, in English and in German. It was a moment of profound, shared grief, a recognition of the universal human cost of the war. And then, there was the football. The story of the Christmas truce football matches has become one of the most powerful and enduring legends of the First World War. The reality is complex, a mixture of fact and myth. There is no definitive evidence of a single, organized match between the British and the Germans, with a proper score and a referee. But there is overwhelming evidence of numerous, spontaneous kickabouts, all along the front. Ernie Williams, a soldier with the 6th Cheshires, remembered it vividly. Even 70 years later, the ball appeared from somewhere, I don't know where, but it came from their side. It wasn't from our side that the ball came. They made up some goals and one fellow went in goal and then it was a general kickabout. I should think there were a couple of hundred taking part. There was no referee and no score, no tally at all. It was simply a melee. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of soldiers, British and German, their drab khaki and field gray uniforms mingling, chasing a makeshift ball across the frozen mud of no man's land. The goals were piles of coats or caps. The ground was treacherous, pockmarked with shell holes, but for a few hours, they were not soldiers. They were just men, playing a game. The sound of laughter, of shouts of encouragement, replaced the sound of gunfire. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, a defiant celebration of life in the very heart of death. Johannes Niemann, a German lieutenant, even claimed a score for one of the matches. He wrote that his men played against a group of Scottish soldiers, and that the game ended 3-2 for Fritz. He also noted, with some amusement, that the Germans discovered that the Scotsmen wore nothing under their kilts. While this specific account is disputed, it speaks to the powerful myth that grew out of these events. The idea of a proper football match, with a winner and a loser, was perhaps a way of making sense of the beautiful absurdity of the situation. However, it is crucial to remember that the truce was not universal. In some sectors, the fighting continued with unabated ferocity. On Christmas Day, men were still being killed and wounded. Some officers, on both sides, were furious about the fraternization, viewing it as a dangerous breakdown of military discipline. They did everything they could to stop it. A young corporal named Adolf Hitler, serving with the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry, was reportedly one of those who disapproved of the truce, calling it dishonorable. This fragile, spontaneous peace could not last. The high commands on both sides were horrified. They saw it as a direct threat to the war effort. How could you order men to kill an enemy they had just shared a cigarette and a laugh with? Orders were issued, demanding an immediate end to the truce. The generals, safe in their chateau far behind the lines, could not tolerate the idea of their soldiers seeing the enemy as human. One British soldier remembered the moment the war returned. "We got orders, come down the trench. Get back in your trenches, every man." The generals behind must have seen it and got a bit suspicious, so what they did, they gave orders for a battery of guns behind us to fire, and a machine gun to open out, and officers to fire their revolvers at the Jerrys. Course that started the war again. We were cursing them to hell, cursing the generals. We hated the sight of the bloody generals. The truce ended as it had begun, not with a single order, but in a series of sputtering, reluctant resumptions of violence. In many places, the return to war was almost apologetic, a final handshake, a shouted promise to see you after the war, a warning shot, fired high into the air, to signal that the killing was about to recommence. Slowly, reluctantly, the soldiers returned to their trenches. The war was back on, but the generals were not content to simply end the truce. They were determined to ensure it never happened again. The Christmas Truce of 1914 had terrified them. It had revealed a dangerous truth, that the soldiers on both sides had more in common with each other than they did with the men who commanded them. That, given the choice, they would choose peace over war. This was an intolerable threat to military discipline, to the entire structure of command and control. And so, the high commands on both sides took systematic, calculated steps to prevent any repeat. In the months following the truce, strict orders were issued. Fraternization with the enemy was now a court-martial offense. Officers were instructed to maintain constant aggression, to keep the men focused on the enemy as a threat, not as a fellow human being. Raiding parties were increased. Snipers were given free rein. The live and let live system, which had allowed the truce to flourish, was actively suppressed. But the most brutal measure came the following Christmas. In December 1915, as Christmas Eve approached, the generals were watching. They were waiting to see if the soldiers would try again, and they were ready. Along many parts of the front, explicit orders were given to artillery batteries. On Christmas Eve, as the sun set, the guns opened up, a massive, deliberate barrage, designed not to achieve any military objective, but simply to drown out any carols, to shatter any hope of peace, to kill the spirit of the truce before it could even begin. The shelling was relentless. It continued through the night, into Christmas Day. Any soldier who dared to climb out of his trench, any attempt to shout a greeting across no man's land, was met with immediate, overwhelming fire. In some sectors, soldiers still tried. Private Robert Keating, a British soldier, wrote in his diary of how he and his comrades shouted greetings to the Germans, how they stood on the parapets and even met in no man's land, despite strict orders not to. But the moment was shattered by their own artillery, firing on the German trenches, forcing them to run back. The truce lasted only minutes, not hours, and it was a pale shadow of what had happened the year before. In the Canadian sector, the suppression was even more violent. When German soldiers called out, "Merry Christmas, Canadians," and some Canadian sentries responded, a sergeant immediately opened fire, killing 2 German soldiers. The Germans returned fire, killing 2 Canadians. The brief moment of potential peace was drowned in blood. The generals had made their point. There would be no repeat of 1914. The Christmas Truce of 1914 was never repeated on such a scale. In the years that followed, the war became even more brutal, more dehumanizing. The introduction of poison gas at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, the massive attritional slaughter of the Somme and Verdun in 1916, the relentless, grinding horror of Passchendaele in 1917, all served to deepen the hatred and bitterness between the two sides. The high commands had succeeded. The brief moment of shared humanity on Christmas Day, 1914, became a distant, almost unbelievable memory. A fairy tale from a more innocent time. But the story of the truce endured. It was a story told in thousands of letters home, in diaries, in the hushed conversations of veterans. It was a story that refused to be forgotten. It was a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can find a way to connect, to find common ground, to choose peace over war, if only for a day. It raises a profound and unsettling question. If the men who were actually fighting the war, the men who were living and dying in the mud, could so easily lay down their arms and see the humanity in their enemies, then who, or what, was the real enemy? Was it the men in the trenches opposite them, who sang the same carols and missed the same families? Or was it the generals, the politicians, the emperors and kings, the abstract forces of nationalism and imperialism that had sent them there to die? And when the soldiers chose peace, why did the generals respond with calculated brutality, with artillery barrages designed to kill not just men, but the very idea of peace itself? The Christmas Truce is more than just a historical curiosity. It is a powerful symbol of hope, but also a stark reminder of the forces that work against that hope. It is a reminder that the desire for peace, for connection, for a shared humanity, can be more powerful than the orders of generals or the rhetoric of politicians. But it is also a reminder that those in power will do everything they can to suppress that desire, to keep the war machine running, to ensure that the killing never stops. If this story of a moment of peace in the midst of war and the forces that crushed it has moved you, help me to continue telling these vital stories. A like and a subscription make a huge difference in keeping this history alive for a new generation. See you soon.